Beneath the water at Port Royal, archaeologists found the remains of a vessel under a building. No one can yet say with confidence why it was there, or exactly how the vessel and the building came to occupy the same place. But the discovery captures the real mystery of Port Royal better than any chest of pirate treasure. The real puzzle was not the vessel alone. Above it had stood a room. Beyond that room were other buildings, workshops, homes, and streets. None of them had been built beneath the sea. The familiar story says that Port Royal was the wickedest city on earth, a refuge of pirates punished when an earthquake swallowed it whole. It is vivid, simple, and misleading in almost every important way. The city did not descend intact into clear water. Its ground failed unevenly. Buildings settled, tilted, collapsed, or moved with spreading sediment. Some areas remained above water. Others disappeared beneath water and sand. And in protected deposits, destruction created conditions that preserved fragments of ordinary life. 3 centuries later, investigators examined 5 buildings in the submerged commercial center. Their evidence included houses and a work complex associated with a pipe shop, a tavern, and a cobbler's shop. Fragile organic materials survived in oxygen-poor sediment. Human remains lay beneath the bricks of one fallen structure. Port Royal is not only an archaeological site, it is a grave. So the central question is not simply why the town was destroyed. It is why its destruction preserved evidence that the later pirate legend obscured. Because Port Royal was more than a lawless harbor. It was a fortified English port connected to privateering, global trade, plantation expansion, and the trafficking of enslaved Africans. Its wealth depended on merchants, sailors, craftspeople, soldiers, servants, poor residents, and people forced into labor by an expanding colonial system. On the 7th of June, 1692, the ground exposed the physical weakness beneath that city. Archaeology would later expose its human structure. The word liquefaction encourages the wrong image. It sounds as though sand simply turns into water. That is not what happened. Port Royal stood on the palisadoes, the long coastal spit guarding the entrance to Kingston Harbor. Much of the settlement rested on loose deposits saturated by water. Under normal conditions, sand grains pressed against one another and carried the weight of streets, walls, warehouses, and fortifications. Then the shaking began. Water occupied the spaces between the grains. During strong motion, it could not drain away quickly enough. Pressure rose. The effective contact that gave the soil strength diminished. Ground that had supported heavy construction could no longer carry the same load. A foundation might settle, a wall might lean. Ground near the harbor could spread sideways. Cracks could open as one mass of sediment moved away from another. A building could collapse where it stood or travel with the failing shoreline. That is why Port Royal cannot be shown as one platform dropping into the sea. The earthquake produced different outcomes in different places. Some structures were shattered, some subsided, some moved as the ground deformed. A large portion of the town was submerged beneath water and sand, while other areas survived above the harbor. Sea waves were reported, and water added to the destruction. But the most distinctive failure began below the buildings. The harbor did not simply rise over Port Royal. Port Royal lost part of the ground that separated it from the harbor. Survivors described houses and people being swallowed by the earth. Their language records terror, not a technical model. Reverend Emmanuel Heath, writing shortly after the disaster, interpreted what he saw as divine judgment upon an ungodly town. His account helps explain the legend. It does not explain the geology. The exact magnitude of the earthquake remains uncertain. No modern instrument measured it, and the fault that produced it has not been identified with confidence. Yet the consequences beneath Port Royal are unmistakable. Strong shaking, liquefaction, settlement, lateral ground movement, collapse, and submergence. Then something less obvious happened. Water and sediment covered parts of the ruined town. In some low-oxygen deposits, decay slowed. Relationships that ordinary rebuilding might have erased. A wall beside a floor, a workspace inside a building, objects associated with rooms could survive despite the damage. The earthquake did not create a perfect time capsule. It created a damaged archive. Why place a dense town on such vulnerable ground? Because in the 17th century, the location looked less like a danger than an opportunity. England captured Jamaica from Spain in 1655. Holding the island required more than planting a flag. The new colony stood within a contested Caribbean, exposed to rival empires and armed ships. At the entrance to Kingston Harbour, the palisados offered deep, protected water and a narrow approach that could be defended. 6 forts guarded the 17th century town. From this position, English Jamaica could protect the harbour, provision vessels, and project force into the region. Strategically, the choice made sense. Its usefulness was also commercial. Ships brought cargo, information, crews, and credit. Warehouses, workshops, houses, religious buildings, and administrative spaces crowded around the harbor. In 37 years, a frontier settlement became a pivotal fortified port. Privateers contributed to that rise. They were not simply pirates under another name. A privateer operated under a commission authorizing attacks on enemy shipping. The boundary could blur in practice, but the legal distinction reveals something essential. Violence at sea could serve state policy. Port Royal gave commissioned vessels a base. Merchants supplied voyages, extended credit, handled cargo, and converted captured goods into commercial wealth. Government power, maritime violence, and business met in the same streets. But a port cannot survive on prizes and cannon alone. Ships needed food, repair, storage, and labor. Households needed fuel, cookware, clothing, and tools. Craftspeople made and repaired what a crowded maritime town consumed. Commercial objects and imported goods speak to transactions extending far beyond the return of a raiding vessel. Recovered material connects Port Royal to Europe and Asia. The town was not a stage on which pirates briefly spent stolen money. It was a node in regional and transatlantic exchange. The place that made Port Royal vulnerable was therefore the place that made it powerful. The harbor offered access. The forts offered control. The streets converted movement at sea into wealth on land. Every new building expressed confidence in that system. Every new building increased what that saturated shore was being asked to support. The pirate legend concentrates attention on people who arrived with weapons and prizes. Archaeology redirects it toward those who kept the city functioning between arrivals. Merchants financed voyages, supplied vessels, arranged storage, and linked the harbor to distant markets. Sailors moved goods. Craftspeople repaired shoes, maintained structures, prepared food, and supplied everyday needs. Soldiers guarded the town. Officials recorded property and commerce. Servants and poor residents sustained households while leaving fewer written traces than wealthy owners. And enslaved Africans were forced into the system that Port Royal helped expand. Royal African Company vessels and private traders brought enslaved people through Jamaica. Human beings were recorded, priced, sold, and compelled into labor as plantation agriculture grew. Port Royal became important to the traffic that supplied that economy. Its prosperity cannot be separated from slavery. This does not mean every artifact can be assigned to a particular enslaved person. An object cannot automatically reveal its user's status, birthplace, or private story. Archaeology becomes dangerous when silence is treated as permission to invent. But the wider structure is clear. Construction and maintenance across the colonial system drew on the labor, knowledge, and skills of enslaved Africans. Commercial wealth circulated through an economy built on coercion. Imported luxuries and ordinary tools belonged to the same unequal system. The 5 excavated buildings helped bring that system down to street level. There were houses and working spaces. A pipe shop, tavern, and cobbler's shop occupied part of the investigated complex. Objects associated with cooking, trade, craft, and domestic life reveal repeated routines rather than one endless pirate celebration. The cobbler's shop returns us to worn shoes and continual repair. The tavern becomes a business within a working district rather than proof of unique depravity, while the houses remind us that the port was lived in, not merely visited. Human remains beneath one fallen building make every discussion of preservation begin with death. UNESCO and ICOMOS describe the archaeological property as a grave site for merchants and the wealthy, but also for the poor and enslaved. That shared mortality does not make the society equal. The earthquake killed within a hierarchy it did not create and could not morally erase. By the morning of the 7th of June, 1692, defense, trade, coercion, and daily labor connected every part of Port Royal. Then the town lost its foundations. There is no need to invent one victim to understand the human scale. The known layout allows us to trace the kinds of physical consequences that would have unfolded inside spaces archaeology has identified. Inside a house, shaking would travel through the floor and walls. Objects would shift. Masonry could begin to fall. In a working complex, tools and stored material would be surrounded by structures transferring their weight into weakening soil. Along the street, the surface could cease to move as one piece. Settlement would change levels, cracks could open, and ground could spread toward the harbor. The same earthquake could act differently across short distances. A wall might remain standing while a neighboring foundation settled. One building could collapse into its footprint while another shifted with the ground below it. Water and sediment could enter spaces that moments earlier belonged to streets and rooms. Witnesses saw a world violating its most basic rule. The ground was supposed to remain beneath them. Later accounts compressed that terror into a single image: Port Royal swallowed by the sea. The physical evidence is more complicated. Some parts remained above water, some were ruined and later cleared or rebuilt. Some entered the harbor in broken, displaced form. Estimates of the affected area and death toll vary, and exact precision would create confidence the evidence cannot support. Estimates commonly place the immediate death toll in the thousands, with further deaths following from injury and disease. Beneath one fallen building, the later discovery of human remains interrupts any temptation to turn the event into a spectacle of collapsing architecture. A fallen wall could be architecture, evidence, and burial at once. Above water, survivors returned to a damaged town. Useful materials could be recovered or reused. Buildings and streets could be cleared, altered, or rebuilt. On land, weather and later construction continued the work of erasure. Underwater, destructive processes continued as well. Collapse disturbed rooms, salvage removed objects, currents shifted lighter material, and exposure damaged fragile remains. But where sediment covered structures rapidly, it could also protect them. The earthquake did not preserve Port Royal despite the violence of its destruction. In some places, preservation became one of that violence's consequences. It killed and sealed. In 1981, the Jamaica National Heritage Trust, Texas A&M University, and the Institute of Nautical Archaeology began a long investigation of the submerged commercial center. Over roughly a decade, researchers examined 5 buildings in detail. 5 buildings sound small beside an entire city. Archaeologically, they open an extraordinary set of relationships. A tool matters on its own. Inside a known work area, it can help identify repeated activity. A ceramic vessel can speak to storage, preparation, consumption, or trade. Timbers and walls reveal construction. Food remains illuminate diet. Commercial objects connect rooms to markets far beyond Jamaica. Low oxygen conditions preserved an unusual quantity of fragile organic material. Evidence that usually decays in a tropical urban environment survived beneath sediment. Yet the site is not frozen at one perfect instant. Shaking displaced structures, collapsed scrambled material, water-moved objects. Survivors attempted recovery. Sediment both protected and concealed. Centuries of natural and human disturbance continued after 1692. The water is not a glass display case. This is why the position of evidence matters and why interpretation must remain cautious. The vessel beneath a building is compelling precisely because its relationship is unresolved. It is not permission to invent a hidden pirate story. The submerged remains preserve parts of the urban plan and evidence of residential, commercial, religious, administrative, and military life. Together with documentary records, they make it possible to reconstruct more than a disaster. They reconstruct work, consumption, architecture, commerce, and inequality. In July 2025, the archaeological ensemble of 17th century Port Royal was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. The recognition joined the surviving town and submerged remains into one archaeological landscape. That unity is important. Port Royal's preservation does not redeem the system that built it. It makes the parts of that system harder to separate. Fortifications, privateering, imported goods, plantation expansion, and enslaved labor belong to the same history. Where the pirate legend selects spectacle, archaeology restores relationships. At the beginning was a vessel beneath a building. It sounded like the opening of an adventure. Instead, it became a warning against easy stories. What survives is not an underwater Atlantis, but the material record of a working colonial system. The town guarded an imperial harbor. It supplied armed vessels and transformed maritime violence into commerce. Its rooms contained trade, craft, food, worship, administration, and domestic life. Its prosperity was inseparable from the trafficking and forced labor of enslaved Africans. Then saturated ground lost the strength to support what had been built upon it. The earthquake fractured architecture and killed within an unequal society. But parts of the town entered an environment where sediment and low oxygen protected evidence that rebuilding and decay might otherwise have erased. That is the paradox of Port Royal. Destruction erased lives and preserved relationships. For centuries, the city was remembered through noise. Cannon, drinking, piracy, sermons, punishment. Underwater, its testimony is quieter. A wall beside a floor, a workshop inside a commercial block. Fragile material surviving beneath sediment. Human remains under fallen bricks. A vessel where no simple story can explain it. Port Royal was buried twice. First beneath water and sediment, then beneath a legend easier to remember than the colonial world it concealed. Archaeology uncovers both burials. It replaces the question of why a wicked city was punished with a harder one. The 17th century town did not survive whole. It survived in evidence, contradictions, and unanswered questions. The hardest of them remains: what kind of world required this city to flourish before the ground failed?